Colonial rule affects tribal lives in India. This video is brought to you by Unacademy in association with GyanCentral.com. Now, the lives of tribal peoples had changed during the British rule. We know that. But what were these changes? Now, first of all, we'll be looking at what happened to the tribal chiefs of those times. Because before the British came in, they were pretty important people. And what happened to the roles of the tribal chiefs after the British came into the picture? Now, before they enjoyed a certain amount of economic power and had the right to administer and control their own territories. And sometimes they even had their own police and decided on local rules of land and forest management. But once the British actually came and ruled over them, the functions and powers of the tribal chiefs changed too much. They were allowed to keep the land titles over a cluster of villages and rent out lands, but they lost much of their administrative power. So they were forced to follow the laws made by the British officials in India. Now they also had to pay a certain tribute to the British. They were even asked to maintain discipline of the tribal groups on behalf of the British. So all in all, they lost all the authority they had earlier enjoyed amongst their own people. The next point we'll be looking at is what happened to the shifting cultivators or the jhum cultivators. Now, first of all, the British were not enthralled with the idea of the groups who moved about and did not have a fixed home. They wanted the tribal groups to settle down. The reason was obvious. The British thought settled peasants were easier to control and administer than the people who were always on the move. So the British also wanted a regular revenue source for the state, and they introduced land settlements for this matter. We've talked about the land revenue systems previously. If you can recall from the previous videos, the tenants were to pay rent to the landowner, who in turn paid revenue to the state. Anyways, the British's effort to settle the jhum cultivators was not very successful. Why? Well, the settled plough cultivation is not easy in areas where water is scarce and the soil is dry. In fact, the jhum cultivators who took to plough cultivation often suffered because their fields did not produce good yields at all. So, what happened was that jhum cultivators in the northeast India insisted on continuing with their traditional practice. And due to these protests, the British had to ultimately allow them the right to carry on shifting cultivation, but only in some parts of the forest. Now, we have clearly established that the life of tribal groups was directly connected to the forest. So, any changes in the forest laws had a considerable effect on the tribal lives. Now, the British extended their control over all forests and declared that the forests were state property. Some forests were classified as reserved forests, for they produced timber which the British wanted. Now, in these forests, people were not allowed to move freely or practice jhum cultivation or collect fruits or hunt animals. You know, we discussed the tribal activities in our previous video. So, no such tribal activity was permitted in those reserved forests. So, how were jhum cultivators to survive such a situation? But then what happened was the British stopped the tribal people from living inside forests, but they too had to face a problem. From where would they come up with enough labor to cut trees or transport logs or any of the work that they could get from these tribal people? So the colonial officials came up with a solution. They decided that they would give the jhum cultivators small patches of land in the forests and allow them to cultivate these on the condition that those who lived in the villages would have to provide labor to the forest department and look after the forests. So, in many regions in the forest department established forest villages to ensure a regular supply of cheap labor. Now, many tribal groups reached a point where they had to react against these colonial forest laws. They disobeyed these new rules, continued with the practices that were declared illegal, and at times rose up in open rebellion. For example, there was a revolt of Sungram Sangma in 1906 in Assam and the forest satyagraha of 1930s in the central provinces. Now let us look at what was the impact of these forest laws on the tribal people. At first, there was this problem with trading. Now, during the 19th century, the tribal groups found that the traders and the moneylenders were coming to the forests more often, wanting to buy forest produce, offering cash loans, and asking them to work for wages. Now, the tribal groups did not work out in the beginning what was really happening. It took them some time to understand the consequences of what was happening. Now, let us consider the case of the silk growers. In the 18th century, Indian silk was in demand in the European markets. The fine quality of Indian silk was highly valued and the exports from India increased a lot. So, as the market expanded, East India Company officials tried to encourage silk production to meet the growing demand. Hazaribagh, which is the present day Jharkhand, was an area where the Santals reared cocoons. Now, the traders dealing in silk sent in their agents who gave loans to the tribal people and collected the cocoons. Now, the growers were paid rupees 3 to rupees 4 for 1,000 cocoons. Now, these were then exported to Bardwan or Gaya, where they were sold at 5 times the price. Now, the middlemen, the so called middlemen, because they arranged deals between the exporters and the silk growers, made huge profits. Now, the silk growers earned nothing, close to nothing. Understandably, many tribal groups saw the market and the traders as their main enemies. Now, another major problem they faced was the search for work. Now, the plight of the tribals who had to go far away from their homes in search for work was even worse. Now, from the late 19th century, tea plantations started coming up and mining became an important industry. The tribals were recruited in large mines of Jharkhand and they were recruited in large numbers to work at the tea plantations of Assam. Now, they were recruited through contractors who paid them miserably low wages and prevented them from ever returning home. So, in the first point, they were exploited by the money lenders, and in the second point, when they went the tribals went away far from their homes, they were exploited by their contractors. Now, since the tribal people faced so many predicaments due to the forest laws imposed on them, they were bound to rise up in rebellion against the British. But were they capable? Yes, they were. There were many tribal rebellions, and in our next video, we'll cover up the famous Birsa movement of the tribal community.